So hello everyone, welcome back for another episode. Today's topic is about the greatest political and economic ideology known to man, which is Georgism. And this is something I very strongly believe in. It's political, I guess it's really an economic ideology. It's not like there are many different directions and different like political ideas you can kind of incorporate into it or bounce off of it. So at its core, it's an economic idea, right? And I really got into this at Rice. It was actually Arjun who told me about it at first. But I've really come to embrace it as like kind of the core of my political thinking. Like this is what we need to do to achieve utopia. So I'm very excited to share it with all of you. So this is Henry George, and as the next slide will detail, he was the founder of this idea, and he didn't really come from a formal economics background. So he lived during the 19th century. He was born in Philadelphia, moved to San Francisco, kind of took a bunch of odd jobs, but eventually ended up at the San Francisco Times and worked his way up the ranks and became managing editor. And by the time he reached California, this was around like the 1860s. This was in the midst of the California gold rush. And San Francisco was a boom town. People were flocking to the Bay Area to mine in the gold mines, and there was a huge influx of wealth, right? You can think of like this American frontier sort of aesthetic, this environment where, anyone can kind of go out there and strike it rich. And this background is really essential to understanding where this idea came from, where his ideas came from. So he was in this environment, he developed like a skill at writing and arguing because he was a managing editor, wrote a lot of editorials for the Times. And he eventually started kind of giving his thoughts on the impact of the gold rush and the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad in California. And it kind of culminated in this book called Progress and Poverty, where Henry George tries to reconcile, okay, we have all of this wealth in California, right? We have, this boom town of San Francisco, and we have these mines that are just churning out gold. Why are there still poor people? And why are there slums in San Francisco? And, we have such great economic bounty all around us. So he tried to kind of reconcile these conflicting realities in this book. So he published it in 1879. It actually ended up becoming the second most popular English language book globally of the 1890s, behind the Bible. So it sold 3 million copies around the world. It became one of the most influential books of its time, and it really made a huge political impact. So much so that like Henry George was a nationally known figure. He moved to New York City in the 1880s, ran for mayor, came in second place, actually ahead of Teddy Roosevelt, came in third place. And he had quite an influence on a lot of global thinkers, from Winston Churchill to FDR. All sorts of writers and politicians kind of latched onto this idea. So we're going to go into detail of what exactly Progress and Poverty says about, why we have poverty in the midst of economic progress. So the central question of the book is, why do increases in wealth correlate with increases in poverty? And you can even think about like how this happens today, right? Like in California, of course, where this is still happening. You can go to Los Angeles and see Skid Row, or in San Francisco has a huge homeless population. People are literally using the restroom on the street, despite it being, kind of this global hub of technology and innovation where, most of America's new GDP is being generated. We still have like this debilitating poverty that exists in these cities. And that's a paradox, right? You would expect that a rising tide would lift all boats, and that, with increasing wealth, we could kind of solve the problem of poverty. And that's always been the goal of every generation, is to eradicate homelessness, eradicate hunger, but we never quite seem to get there. So this book is still very timely in its diagnosis of our kind of boom and bust cycle of economic development and the persistent presence of poverty in our population. So the book starts off by setting up the three factors of production. This is essential to understanding Georgism. We have three things that kind of make the economy work, right? We got land, which includes all natural resources, includes all locations on Earth, so that's land and water, minerals, oil, etc. And the agents who own this factor of production are landowners, and they derive their wealth from rent, right? So you own a piece of land and you charge people rent to use that land. The second factor is labor, which is any and all human exertion that's usually acted upon natural resources, right? So you can see this laborer using a machine and he is laboring. And laborers get their wealth from wages, right? They perform work, often in factories or maybe in an office, and they get paid for it. And the third factor of production is capital. It's all wealth that is used to create more wealth. So you can think of machinery, robots, etc. And the people who own capital are investors or capitalists, and they derive their wealth from interest, right? So they might invest their money in the stock market, or invest some money in a new business, or provide machines for use, or a factory for use, and then they will get interest off of that productivity. And I should note that I do not have a formal economics background, so if I'm wrong about anything, please feel free to point it out. I will try my best to be accurate, but I can't guarantee that I'm using all the terminology correctly. But this is what the book sets up, in the beginning chapters. So keep that in mind as we kind of approach this thought experiment, right? Let's say that you're an apple farmer, right, and you move out. It's the 1850s, and you move out to the frontier of the United States, where it's just unincorporated territory, right? It's been cleared of the Native Americans, and it's just open lands that nobody owns. So you approach this area where you want to settle down. There's no one around you, and you see a bunch of apple trees, right? And there are 4 plots of land available to you. And you get 1 apple per day from each tree on the plot of land. So you obviously choose the most productive plot of land, right? The one with 4 trees is shown in this picture. You're not going to choose the one with fewer trees because you would get fewer apples. So you start farming, your wages are 4 apples per day. You are using your labor to extract apples from the trees, which are the natural resource, right? So think of this as the margin of production, right? And we'll kind of define that term later on, but keep it in your head that 4 apples is currently the margin of production. Soon someone else moves out to the frontier, right? Now you have a neighbor. They decide to take the next best plot of land, which has 3 trees on it producing 3 apples. This reduces the margin of production to 3 apples, right? We're defining here the margin of production is the greatest amount of productivity that can be produced by a piece of land that can be had for 0 rent. Because what happens when this new person moves next to you, the rent of your land goes up to 1, right? It's the produce of your land minus the margin of production. Now, why is this the case? Because if your neighbor came up to you and said, hey, I want to use your 4-tree piece of land to mine apples, you would be like, okay, pay me 1 apple in rent, right? Because otherwise, if it were 2 apples in rent, you'd go to the next best piece of land and get more apples without having to pay you rent. So rent becomes the difference between the most productive land and the marginally productive lands, which is the land that can be had for 0 rent. So more people, another person moves in, they take the second best plot of land, produces 2 apples, the margin of production moves down. So now the rent that you can charge on your land is 2 apples instead of 1, and so on. And so all the land is occupied, and now you, with the best, most productive piece of land, are charging 3 apples in rent. So this is the law of rent, right? That as the margin of production decreases, the rent charged on the highest productivity piece of land goes up. So it's best summarized by the sentence that I did not write, which is the rent of land is determined by the excess of its production over which the same application can secure from the least productive land in use. So landowners can claim everything above what the same application of labor and capital can secure in the least productive occupation in which they can freely engage, right? So this kind of sets up this problem where, landowners take up all of this extremely productive land. And you can think of productivity not just in terms of there are literally 4 trees on this land, or this land has a gold mine or something, but think about advances in technology, right? Where suddenly if you have a new apple growing hormone that you can apply to the trees, suddenly you can produce 16 apples on that plot of land, right? Or if your land becomes connected to a highway, suddenly the productivity of that land becomes greater. And rent continues to increase as the margin of production is pushed down. As people spread out and take up less and less desirable lands, the more desirable land becomes more difficult to attain, right? So that kind of gives us this equation that's featured prominently in Progress and Poverty, which is that production is the sum of the three factors of production. So therefore, production minus rent equals wages plus interest, right? So we're all, producing as part of an economy, landowners, laborers, and capitalists. But whatever is taken in the form of rent, that's what's left over to laborers and capitalists. So this is kind of like a fundamental property, right? Is that, we can increase production, right? We can produce more and more apples or, whatever is being produced by our economy. But that means rent will also go up, which leaves less and less left over to both the owners of capital and to laborers. So I created this graph that kind of demonstrates the concept, right? As the quality of land increases, the proportion of wealth that's taken by capitalists as interest and laborers as wages stays constant, but the amount taken by landlords as rent increases. So this really explains the problem, right? That landlords are taking a greater and greater proportion of the wealth, and less is left over for capitalists and laborers to kind of live off of and be productive off of. So it's kind of this never-ending cycle of increasing rent and decreasing quality of life, which George believes explains why there's this persistent poverty problem in our wealthiest places. But you might be thinking, okay, so the proportion stays the same, but that doesn't necessarily explain poverty, right? That might explain why we don't get richer as the margin of production goes down and rent goes up, but it doesn't explain why we might be getting poorer. But George explains this with this idea of speculation, right? That with the decreasing margin of production across the country, landowners are speculating on their land. They're not just recognizing that their rent is increasing as productivity increases. They are leveraging themselves into the future and holding on to land and using it as an investment on the predication that this increase will continue indefinitely, right? So what ends up happening is that increases in rent actually outpace the overall increase in wealth, because people are buying up land and they're kind of holding on to it and waiting for the price to increase and charging more and more in rent than what the market can handle, because they expect, well, in the future, this land will be worth way more than it currently is. So this creates an artificial scarcity of land and natural resources, because as people speculate, they're taking potentially productive land out of productivity, right? They're removing it from availability. As landowners kind of monopolize this land, they are not only making it unproductive, but they are making it so that businesses and laborers are paying more and more out. The increase in rent that businesses and laborers are paying outpaces what they're actually producing. So this is where the entire idea of depression comes from. George argues that economic depressions fundamentally are caused by this overextension of rent. That rent keeps increasing at a greater rate than the economy is actually producing things, and eventually, the house of cards falls over, and we have a depression because the capitalists and laborers can't make up for that difference in rent anymore. So it's a boom-bust cycle that kind of repeats itself over and over again, and that's the fundamental argument behind Progress and Poverty. So we've covered kind of the economic angle of it, but there's also a moral argument that Henry George makes about why land ownership and speculation is wrong. And I really think this sign kind of epitomizes it in a really succinct way, right? Everybody works but the vacant lot. So let's say, you paid $3,600 for this empty piece of land in the middle of the city, right? And then you just hold on to it until it's worth $6,000. But you didn't do anything, right? You just left it empty. You might not even have mowed it. You just kind of sat there and okay, well, the value is increasing. In 20 years, it's worth, almost twice as much as it was initially worth. Where did that wealth come from? It came from the people around you, right? As the city grows and it builds infrastructure and people open businesses and coffee shops and factories nearby, the value of your land goes up. But you didn't put in any labor to make that land worth more. You didn't do anything to the land. You just kind of held it in perpetuity. And eventually you figured, okay, I want to flip this and make some cheap, like easy money. So the moral argument is that communities are creating the wealth that becomes trapped in land values. That a lot of landowners will come in and buy up land in the middle of very productive places like San Francisco, and they will just sit there and leave it vacant until they can flip it over for a profit. But they didn't do anything to earn that profit. They don't have a right to it because they didn't perform any labor or really do anything to make it more valuable. They just lived off what the community was producing. So you can kind of see this even today in a lot of American cities. This is Houston. On the left is in 1970, and on the right is in 2010. You can see that downtown is covered in parking lots, right? And a lot of those parking lots are owned by speculators who kind of came into downtown Houston and recognized, okay, this is a booming city. Population is increasing 10% every year, and there's big corporations that are just exploding in profit. Why don't we buy up all of this downtown land, centrally located, surrounded by these office towers, and just wait for the values to rise, and we can flip it over and sell it for a profit, right? And they don't put anything on these empty lots because that's risky, right? It's difficult to build a building and take on the risk associated with what if you can't find tenants, and what if the building falls down or something like that. It's easier to just be like, let's buy up this empty lot, maybe we'll put a parking lot on it and charge people money to park there, but otherwise we will wait until the time is right to sell it and make some free money, right? We don't have to do anything, we don't have to take any risks or perform any labor on the land. It's just going to sit there and become a line item in our investment portfolio. And obviously, for many reasons, this is bad, right? This is lands that could be used productively. It could house people. It could be, a new school or office building, but it's being removed from economic productivity by speculators who are just kind of indefinitely waiting on it to become valuable. So there are some more factors to the moral argument that kind of play into this theme, right? The first is that no one created land, right? It's not a product of any human labor, so no one really has a claim to it, right? And all land claims ultimately can be traced back to someone stealing or waging war on the land to take it from someone else by force. But no one at the beginning of humanity was granted this land and has a fundamental right to it. So, there's that entire issue. Another is that we can't live without access to natural resources, right? We need water and air and land to live on. It's not like we can magically float and not occupy land. So it's immoral to put us at the mercy of landowners who will charge us, whatever price they want for us to live on land. We're kind of hostages in that situation because we'll pay whatever price we need to. People in San Francisco are paying $5,000 a month to live in a closet, right? It's exploitative to charge people for something that they fundamentally need to live. Another is that monopolizing land strips people of the right to the products of their labor. And I feel like this quote that I pulled really explains that the best. Because human beings can't produce the things they need to survive unless they have equal access to land. The basic human right to life entails the right to equal access to the gifts of nature. So being required to pay a private landowner for access to land is equivalent to having to pay for one's right to live, right? It kind of ties into the second bullet point here, which is that, we can't absolve ourselves of using natural resources or else we would die. So we should have the right to at least some of the produce of our natural bounty in order to live. And then the fourth kind of ties back into that undeveloped lot argument I was just talking about, which is that the productivity of the most valuable land is a function of socially produced infrastructure. What makes land valuable in cities? It's proximity to transportation networks, like the interstate highways and the railroads and the airports, being near parks and schools and markets, stuff like that. All of those things are created socially. We all invest in them. We're paying taxes to build highways. Some other people are putting risk in to open a new business, a corner store or a coffee shop, and that makes all lands more valuable. So it makes sense that that socially created wealth should be socialized, and that we should redistribute that wealth amongst everybody, because everybody has a right to it. We're all contributing to land values, not just the landowner, especially not the landowner. And I'm sorry, these questions are really long, so I will just get to them at the end. It's really hard to jump into them. So this Churchill quote, I think, really kind of brings that fourth bullet point into clarity, right? Roads are made, streets are made, railway services are improved, water is brought from reservoirs, often the mountains, and the landlord does nothing. To not one of these improvements does the land monopolist, as a land monopolist, contribute, and yet by every one of them, the value of his land is sensibly enhanced. So Churchill was actually a big proponent of Henry George's ideas and the remedy to those ideas, which we'll discuss in a second. But of course, he got distracted by, a couple of world wars and stuff like that, and never got to see them through into, fruition. But he made a very nice speech in 1909 about why he thought Henry George was right. So what is the solution to this? This is the third part of Progress and Poverty. It's the land value tax. So in order to ensure people can keep the fruits of their labor and live, we have to continue to allow people to privately control land, right? We can't just kind of go to all landowners and be like, okay, the government is going to buy up your lands now and there's nothing you can do about it, right? And we can't have a situation where people can just kind of roam about onto random pieces of land as they see fit, because we need to have buildings and kind of these permanent features that make land productive, right? So George recognized, okay, well, there has to be some rights to use land privately. You still should be able to have a house and a business and be able to fence that off and prevent others from using that land, right? I mean, that's just common sense. But the value of that land should be redistributed communally, right? It's created communally by various socially created infrastructures, so we should redistribute it. So basically, the idea is to recompense society for the loss of its access to that land. So when you buy a plot of land and you fence it off and say no one else can come onto my land, you should be paying society back for the value it's creating in that land. And that's what the land value tax is. You pay a tax on the value of your land that makes up for the fact that that land is no longer accessible to society. So this is a quote from Progress and Poverty. Let those who now hold land retain possession if they want. They may buy and sell or bequeath their lands. Let them even continue to call it their land. We may safely leave them the shell if we take the kernel. It is not necessary to confiscate land, only to confiscate rent. So this is, I think George really recognized this was the least offensive way to put his idea into action, right? You can't kind of go out to every homeowner and business in America and be like, hey, your land is not your land anymore. This is everybody's land. But the tax, is a really eloquent way to reconcile the fact that the value of the land that people occupy is created by society. So we tax people on the rent they charge, but we're not actually removing the right to occupy land from anyone. So one of the great things about the land value tax is that it has no deadweight loss. If you have taken an econ class or have like a beginner's understanding of economics, you'll know that most taxes incur some sort of deadweight loss, right? When you tax like deodorant, for example, and make it more expensive, then fewer people will buy it. But because the supply of land is inelastic, right, you can't create natural resources or destroy them. It just, land is land. We could talk about Dubai and other situations like that if we want, but ultimately, the amount of land in the world is fixed. And because of that, there's no deadweight loss, right? You can't destroy the land, you can't reduce the supply of it. So it's a perfectly efficient tax in theory, in that there's no adverse impact on productivity. It's just the tax is returned to society in full, and so it's a very efficient tax, which is why a lot of economists really like the idea. So you may be thinking, okay, well, we currently tax land, right? We have a property tax that most cities and states levy on land and buildings. So what is the difference between this and a property tax? Well, it's actually a pretty important difference, and it has a lot of really big implications for how our cities are built and how land is used, right? So currently, when you pay a property tax on your house or something, you're paying a tax on both the value of the land and the value of the building or improvements on top of it. So you can look at this example here, right? Under a conventional property tax, let's say you own a plot of land that's worth $100,000. And then on top of it, you have a $300,000 building. Under a normal property tax, you would be taxed on the full value of everything on that land, right? The value of the land itself plus the value of the buildings. So that's $400,000. It's a tax of $4,000, and we have a 1% property tax. However, on the land tax, we're not taxing the value of the building anymore. We are only taxing the value of the raw land. So eventually, you essentially get a tax cut, right? Because you're removing a huge part of your tax bill from your property tax. Instead, we're only taxing someone on the $100,000 land value, and under a 1% tax that would go down to $1,000 in tax per year. So what are the implications of this? When we're taxing buildings, we're making any plot of land that has a building on it more expensive, right? Suddenly, it becomes somewhat inefficient. We're disincentivizing people from owning buildings in a lot of cases, because an easy way for them to reduce their tax bill if they're not interested in, having buildings on their land is to demolish the buildings. And if you currently own a plot of vacant land, it adds a cost to you developing that land. Right now you have to weigh, well, yes, I could develop this land into something useful, but that will make my tax bill go up, and I have to ensure that this new building can pay off that tax bill and net me a profit. So what this essentially does is it creates situations like this image of Houston, right, where it becomes a lot cheaper to hold a vacant lot than it does to hold a lot with buildings on it. And this explains a lot of why cities in America look like this, why you go downtown and there are vacant lots and parking lots everywhere that don't have any buildings on them. Because in a lot of cases, it's a lot cheaper and less risky for a landowner to sit there, charge people to park on their piece of land in downtown. They'll make a nice little profit off of that every month. And just keep on doing that because it keeps their property taxes really low, and it's fine. But yeah, if we want people to use land efficiently, which is putting lands to productive use, putting buildings on it, things that actually contribute to the economy, the land value tax is a great solution, because by removing the tax on buildings and increasing the tax on land itself, we are incentivizing development, right? Then the case becomes, okay, I own this piece of vacant land and I have this land value tax that I have to pay every year. If I build a building on it and the building is not taxed at all, I can offset that land value tax, and it'll actually be more profitable for me to build something that produces more profit than to keep the land vacant. So this is a really important reason why the LVT is still talked about a lot these days, is it's seen as a solution to this issue of like vacant land in American cities, inefficient use of lands that raises housing prices and reduces productivity and removes, a lot of valuable urban land from the market, where it could be doing great things and, growing the economy. So yeah, some of these benefits of LVT: it ends speculation on land. It releases a lot of lands to be used for more productive endeavors than mere speculation and waiting for land values to rise. And this is removing a key source of economic instability, at least according to George. It improves land use, because by removing taxes on productive use of land, improvements such as buildings, and increasing taxes on the locational value, and LVT rewards the highest and best use of land, right? So now we're giving landowners an incentive to be as productive as possible. They want to build as big of an apartment building or an office building or a factory as possible, so that they can offset the LVT, which is applied only to the raw value of the land. And third, is justice for all, the moral argument, right? That all members of society are compensated for the loss of access to lands that their labor and investment makes valuable. So you could even kind of extend this like the Andrew Yang idea, and I saw a lot of people try to push Andrew Yang on this concept that his universal basic income concept, by saying, okay, you should fund it with a land value tax, right? Because that kind of reconciles the facts that we lose a lot of wealth to landowners who kind of suck it all up through land values and remove it from society, which created it. So it kind of solves that moral argument, and it provides everyone with a safety net. Um, so a few challenges, however, of the LVT, and this kind of explains why it hasn't been implemented on a large scale, is that it's really difficult to determine the raw value of land, right? There are so many factors that influence how much land is worth. And even today, when your house is assessed for property taxes by the city, people get into, big arguments, and it's very controversial about how the value of those things is determined. Basically, you have an assessor come to your house and say, okay, based on like the quality of your house and its size and the location of the land, we think it's worth this much. And people fight about that all the time. And it's one of the reasons why the property tax is one of the least popular forms of tax in America. There's a lot of room for a lot of difficulty there in determining something that's so amorphous, something like value. Second is the impact on existing landowners, right? If we immediately implemented a land value tax of 100%, this would kind of screw over all landowners in America instantly. And it's not really fair, right? You bought into the system, let's say you bought a house or something a few years ago, and you didn't expect to kind of like have your entire retirement nest egg suddenly like obliterated by the government, right? Because a lot of people rely on increasing land values to provide them with a better life down the road, right? You sell your house and make a nice profit on what you initially paid for it, stuff like that. So it would have to be phased in over time, which is obviously complicated. And there is like an equity and justice issue. How do we change the playing field for land ownership without immediately screwing over tens of millions of homeowners? The third is potential revenue. A single tax on land is probably not enough to cover the functions of the US federal government. I think I saw an estimate that all land in the US is worth like $25 trillion or something, but a land value tax would also decrease the value of land, right? Because it makes it less profitable. You don't get to speculate on it anymore. So you would probably have to have other taxes to offset or supplement it. It's not realistic to fund everything with just a land tax. And fourth is an interesting point I actually saw recently about environmental impact, which is that when we encourage landowners to maximize productivity on their land, to offset the tax, this could lead to a lot of undesirable outcomes for the environment, such as if you owned a large piece of land that had oil under it, and suddenly you have a land value tax that's charging you a lot of money, your incentive is going to be to drill out as much of that oil as possible, as quickly as possible, to pay the tax, right? We don't want to ruin the environment after the implementation of such a tax by encouraging all these landowners to just kind of rip up their land and build big, ugly factories on it to make as much money as possible. So that's a smaller point that I haven't seen mentioned as much, but it is still out there as an argument against LVT. But you're probably wondering, okay, well, this is great, nice concept, but has it been tried anywhere? And it has. The land value tax actually does exist in the real world, even though it's not especially popular in America. Actually, Pennsylvania is the only state that allows lands to be taxed at a higher rate than property, right? Most states have constitutional restrictions or amendments that prohibit treating land and property as different classes under a property tax, right? So in Texas, for example, land value tax is illegal because property can only be evaluated as like one entity. You can't split it into land and improvements. Everything has to be taxed at the same rate. Pennsylvania, being the birthplace of Henry George, is the only state to allow it. So the state capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, is a great example of how this has been successfully implemented. They started charging, I guess it's not a pure LVT, but what they did is they tax land at 5 times the rate that they tax improvements. So it's called a split rate property tax, and it's essentially, it follows the same principles of land value tax. So they started this in 1982, and they saw like a number of really significant economic development benefits, right? The number of vacant buildings in the city declines by 88%. The number of businesses increased, new construction there was a boost to new construction in the city. And the mayor and the economic development chief at the time both credit the land value tax as producing this outcome. And Harrisburg isn't the only city in Pennsylvania that has a split rate property tax, but it's one of the 2 most significant examples. I think Allentown is the other example, and they had similar benefits where they saw increased construction, more productive use of land, and fewer vacant buildings and lots. And then a lot of the economic boom in the Asian tiger countries, like including Taiwan and Singapore, has been attributed to land use reforms that include a land value tax. I'm not reading the questions right now, so I don't know what you guys are laughing at, but yeah. So Taiwan, for example, levies a national land value tax that makes up, a significant amount of their government revenue, not the majority, but like about a quarter. And reforms that were actually pushed on them by the American occupation after World War II broke up these like big land monopolies that existed on the island. So they democratized the ownership of land, and then they implemented a land value tax that has helped, accommodate like a large population, a very urban population. Rents in Taipei are not especially high for such a large global city. And it's been pretty successful there. Singapore is a little different. They do have a land value tax, but the bigger point in Singapore is that over 3/4 of the population lives in public housing. So 3/4 of the land in Singapore is owned by the government, and it's actually leased out to people for 99-year lease periods. So very few people in Singapore actually own land, but you can kind of see how it's comparable to a land value tax, and that the value of that land is socialized, right? So the government is the one maintaining and taking in the wealth produced by that land and redistributing it into social programs for everybody, right? And there's no rampant runaway speculation or inefficient use of land, because the government's the one managing these housing developments and putting new housing where they see fit, and that wealth stays in the community, right? It's not going to some private holder or third party who gets to kind of profit off of it. So that's an interesting example of how like Georgia's principles are kind of playing out, even though a land value tax is not being used strictly. I thought of a third good example recently, which was that you can think of what happened in the United States, right, with suburbanization. After World War II, the U.S. subsidized the construction of suburbs, these huge developments where everybody gets to own a piece of land, right? It could be a small piece of land, it's one house, but still, in effect, the U.S. had a massive government program to subsidize and democratize the ownership of land. And you can kind of think of, how big of an impact that's had on the economy, right? This entire idea of the American middle class, where you own like a nice home with a white picket fence, it kind of plays into this Georgist idea, which is that, by increasing access to land and distributing the wealth created by land, we can have better outcomes, right? After the US had this mass suburbanization where millions of people were granted home ownership and ownership of a piece of land, that became like a huge driver of middle-class wealth, that people could own a home and kind of take in the value increase of that home over their lifetimes and sell that home, or bequeath it to their family members, their descendants. That's essentially allowing more and more people to access communally created wealth, right? So even though it's not a land value tax, it's not Georgism, it kind of has the same concept of democratizing wealth and recognizing that, when people have access to the wealth that's vested in land, it's better off for everyone, right? And that's about it. So I will now try and read the questions if I can get the chat back up. I didn't read any of them, I'm sorry. But
No worries. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
That
was very, very interesting. Instead of like going through the chat questions, maybe does anybody have any questions just off the top of
Henry Georgia would be proud of you, Justin.
Thanks. I feel like it was difficult to give because, again, not having an econ background, it's more hard to understand every concept. But yeah, fire away.
Well, yeah. I guess I was thinking if rather than necessarily pose as a question to Justin specifically, like maybe just some comments that could serve as general discussion points, because I guess my initial take on this this philosophy, it seems a little bit incomplete to me. Like it's not a very full description of kind of the mechanics by which like certain goals and objectives can be achieved. It seems quite, it looks at a couple specific facets, but I don't think the description is exceptionally thorough.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the intent, was to have this broadly defined solution. Specifically defined solution to a specific problem. So that's one reason why Georgism has been taken a lot of different directions, right? There's, different ideologies have picked up Georgism and run with it. There's geo-libertarianism, which is like this libertarian idea that, the government should only tax land and redistribute that money, and that's all the government should do, right? And that, that's basically taking libertarianism and fusing Georgism into it. And there's like more left-wing Georgists who are more enamored by the idea of like reducing landlord power and just the equity and moral argument about how we need to redistribute wealth. It's supposed to be like a specific remedy that doesn't try to answer every question about the economy or address every source of instability or poverty. It's supposed to kind of reconcile this one specific question of land values and natural resources with the current functioning of our economy.
So to Kevin's point, I guess when you introduced the philosophy in the first few slides, it seems like it's got some lofty goals, right? I mean, this question of the redistribution of wealth in society and like levels of income inequality. I mean, it feels very fundamental, like almost, maybe at the same level as socialism, communism, like maybe you could even say it in the same breath. But I'll agree with Kevin that at least as far as what was seen in the implementation of your presentation, like the implementation components of your presentation, like I mentioned it in the chat, I'm struggling to see the connection between like a land value tax and redistribution of wealth and like how wealth is distributed in our society. So like, I guess specifically my question is like, I understand like sort of the market of vacant lots. Like, I guess what happened in Pittsburgh is a good example. And like, I can understand why like implementing a land value tax instead of a property tax will lead to more, business improvements. But then how is this related back to the idea that, it seemed like the core idea from the beginning is that like it was rent increases outpacing the generation of wealth by wage earners and capitalists, right? Like because rent outpaces that growth, then you get this income inequality. And so I was struggling to see the connection between those two ideas, between this vacant lots idea, which you presented as a clear problem, but I don't see how like solving that problem with the land value tax presents a fundamental solution to this question of rent outpacing the productivity of I think the increases in wage and whatnot.
I think the vacant lot problem, well, first of all, is like one of my favorite parts of Georgism, so I had probably focused on that more than others might. But also, I think it's like a very like visible symptom of a more granular problem. There's still like an issue of the core idea here is that a lot of wealth is tied up in land and natural resources, right? And it's not just vacant lots in the middle of cities. It's like large, like holdings of land, like raw land across the country. The monopolization of natural resources like oil and gas and all of these other minerals that we use to make our economy function.
And so then my question is that like, the original problem that was posed was this like, just, dramatic levels of income inequality, right? Like in spite of, like, I thought you described it really well in the beginning. We have like, wealth is aplenty, right? There's bounties of wealth, right? And yet we still see so many poor people and homeless people.
Yeah.
So like, I guess to the question about vacant lots, like, I don't know, in like sort of modern society, is it these vacant lots and dilapidated buildings that are the cause of homelessness and things of that nature? And that's the problem that we need to solve in order to solve homelessness? Or there's bigger problems, right? Like, or is this sort of the first thing that needs to be solved?
Well, I think it's more that like the proportion of wealth that goes to people and capitalists is declining, right? In spite of the increasing wealth. I'm trying to think of the best way to expand on that statement. So you can think of like, you know, ideally, right, with like increasing technology and automation and productivity, you know, the average American worker has become far more productive over the past 50 years, thanks to increases in all sorts of technology and education, right? You would expect that increase in productivity to correspond to a rising tide of wealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we wouldn't see dilapidation, homelessness. But you know, it's kind of hidden, especially in an economy that is so complex and relies so much on, you know, these completely foreign concepts to Henry George, like, you know, automated stock market and these microtransactions, you know, government policy that's far more, you know, powerful than it was in his day. But at the end of the day, right, who's controlling the underpinning of the economy? It's still landlords and the people who are gatekeeping natural resources and locational value, right? They're the ones who are, you know, it factors into everything you do in the economy, right? Everything ties back to land. We all have to have some lands to be productive. And they're taking greater and greater shares of that. I think the housing crisis in California is a great example of this principle in action, right? And how it kind of ties into not just vacant lots, but this entire problem of like poverty and homelessness that we keep seeing. In California, you know, there is a shortage of housing and land values have skyrocketed, right? It's now, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars a month to rent a room in San Francisco or Los Angeles. And that's how opportunity is being stripped from laborers and capitalists, right? Like businesses and people move to these places and are trying to participate in, you know, in this great influx of wealth in this booming economy, but they're being held back from those opportunities by land speculators who are kind of removing a lot of land from being developed into housing or opened up for more productive use, you know, to accommodate those homeless people in businesses or to house them. And, you know, we have this cycle where they just keep speculating and the amount of speculation grows. I mean, you know, we have two Californians here and you both know about rent increases and how California is not building enough housing. And a lot of it ties back to the fact that we enable the speculation that encourages people to hold land in a less productive state.
As one of the Californians, presumably you're referencing in
Yes.
this segment right now, I must say that I have quite a different understanding of the situation that you described in terms of, and it's not so much more that I've researched this topic heavily, it's more kind of based on your description kind of how rents and whatnot profits are distributed under a taxed or not taxed system, even in your slides. It seems to me that the reason why a landowner would refrain from developing, say, his land into a residential area is because, you know, just on the tax alone, perhaps, I mean, you're also liable for any interest you might need to pay off to take a loan to develop the properties, right? It's just that it's not worth it to them, right? So in the particular case of homeless people, right, it's not as though these folks have something inherently against homeless people. It's more that if I developed the housing there, like if I could sell it to someone who can pay me a lot of money versus someone who can't pay me a lot of money, I go for the former, right? So it's a very market-based sort of thing, which is why in situations like when you described in Singapore, where the government just literally owns the land and they have priorities other than just, say, you know, making money off of their investments, that's when you can start to see kind of like public housing or more affordable housing kind of going in that direction, right? So like, and kind of going along that, then I guess the land value tax, like it seems kind of just functionally speaking, it's just a overall reduction in the amount of tax you have to pay on any sort of property you develop, right? So yeah, it encourages more development for sure. It's just that at the margin, in a place like San Francisco, I imagine most of the housing would still go to people who'd be paying troves and troves of cash for it rather than folks who are living in the currently homeless.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of getting at the same issue, right? Which is that in a market, a housing market, there's always people willing to pay troves and troves of cash for a house, right? But the problem is, specifically in California, I, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's a constitutional amendment that was passed in the 70s called Prop 13. And this amendment froze property taxes in California. And it's been, for the past 50 years, right? So at the time of its implementation, California set, a maximum property tax across the state of like 2%. And they also limited increases in the property tax charged to homeowners kind of indefinitely, right? Until the property is sold, the appraisal value of the property cannot be increased, right? So basically, millions of California homeowners who bought houses pre-1970s are currently paying very, very little in tax, and are essentially being rewarded for staying in their homes as long as possible. See you, Mellis. Well, he's already out. So, there's a huge speculative problem there, right? Which is that in California, homeowners are like, okay, well, the government has given me this huge incentive to just stay where I am as long as possible to avoid paying higher property taxes. And, California's a booming state and my property just keeps going up and up in value. I'm in Palo Alto and I'm right next to all of these tech campuses in Stanford. And, as long as I keep staying here, the value of my property is only going to go up. So it really eliminates the incentive to turn over the land, right, to someone who might build something on it. And the incentive to redevelop the land, right? It kind of keeps land in stasis because it's the same owners just kind of accruing more wealth that's socially produced in the value of their land. So I really think, the land value tax, if implemented in California, would kind of rectify that situation. It would push this incentive on existing landowners to be like, hey, you need to do something with your land that offsets the impact of this tax, and we're not going to reward you for just sitting there and taking up all this value anymore.
Yeah.
I hope that kind of got to your point.
I've got a couple friends here who are self-described as YIMBYs.
Yeah,
you're probably familiar with the movement. Yeah, there's
Could you introduce it just for those of us, myself included, who are not familiar?
Yeah. It stands for yes in my backyard, in contrast to no, not in my backyard. Because the NIMBY movement, which is what I guess the YIMBY movement is a response to, is this sort of idea of being anti-development, because you don't want it like in your backyard, like a highway or like a big skyscraper, or high density housing, because it could be like disruptive to sort of like the current state of things. And I guess, what Justin was saying earlier about like this static property tax, it is sort of connected to the idea of static property. And so the YIMBY movement is pro-development, certainly like high density housing.
And Georgism is extremely popular among YIMBYs, at least online, it always gets thrown around in Twitter circles. Actually, there's a proposition on the ballot in California this November, Prop 15, which is looking to implement, I guess it's like a locational value tax, basically a land value tax on commercial property, in order to fund schools and other social services that are being impacted by the lack of tax revenue in California. So, there's a movement to kind of overhaul California's tax system to kind of.
Did you go back to the property tax versus land value tax slide?
Yeah.
Also, one thing I've noticed, just cut it real quick. I think it might be better for the purposes of clarity to separate the use of the tax revenue, right? Kind of using land value tax to fund XYZ, kind of the incentive behavior that a particular policy like allows for, right? Because I know one comment you made about like land value tax being deficient in terms of it not being able to generate enough revenue. In my view, it's kind of like we should we should look at those two things separately. First, look at what types of behavior the land value tax incentivizes relative to the existing property tax, and then separately worry about how we're going to pay for all those aircraft carriers we're still manufacturing. That could be a completely separate tax.
So I know Kevin's mentioned a few times now that he thinks that, or wait, so is it like agreed that like land, like just having a land value tax will produce less tax revenue than the property tax? I mean,
well,
like,
the idea would be that yes, if you maintain the same tax rate, but in order to produce an equivalent amount of revenue to a property tax, you would have to raise the land value tax.
for sure. So it doesn't necessarily like, it sounded like Kevin was sort of assuming that land value taxes would always be generating less wealth, but it depends on the rates, right? That means,
Like what they did in Harrisburg was they raised the rate on land and reduced it on property. And it ended up being like land is taxed at 5% and property is taxed at 1%. But the previous combined rate was like 1.7%. So you can see how they had to boost the land rate to make up for the reduction in the property rate.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so you're trying to re-weight the calculus so that for people who do nothing, they pay the same amount. But for people who just have an empty plot of land, they all of a sudden be paying a lot more unless they developed.
Yes. So actually what this ends up doing is like for your typical homeowner, it usually cuts taxes, right? Because when, if you own a home in a suburb, most of the value of your property is in the house and not the land. But it will really boost the tax on someone who owns like an empty parking lot in the middle of downtown, or a lot of like very prime urban lands that's not being used efficiently.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, it's very clear to me how this, sort of spurs and incites more land development, right? That's clear to me. I just, connecting that back to the issue of, rampant poverty in this like places with so much wealth and sort of like outpaced growth of rent versus wages, like that connection is still
well, maybe there's one interesting argument I saw online that might answer that question for you, and it was about like the 2008 crash, right? The Great Recession. I think we all know like what predicated the Great Recession. It was the housing bubble, right? There was a huge increase in home values through 2007 that suddenly collapsed, and people who were over leveraged on their homes suddenly had their most of their financial nest egg wiped out, and there were tons of foreclosures, especially in like the Inland Empire, east of Los Angeles, and it was a huge crisis. And I've seen some Georgists argue that that housing bubble kind of represented this over leveraging of rents, right? That speculators were speculating on lands to an extent that the economy could not actually support paying those home values. And eventually everything just kind of fell down and collapsed because, the rent and
I see.
the
So
value of land was too
couldn't
high.
pay their rent.
Yes, basically. And that's what happened, right? Like tons of homeowners had to foreclose and they couldn't pay their mortgages because...
Well, I would supplement that description of events with a couple more points. My reading of the topic has suggested that it started with basically a back of the mind government mandate for easier credit availability to homeowners. And so banks were basically financially incentivized to make subprime loans, basically to folks that they didn't even the banks didn't expect them to pay it back. The reason it worked for so long is because, as you said, the speculation, just the sheer volume of people brought into the market by this easy credit made the house prices just seem to go up perpetually, right? So people would basically avoid paying rent or paying their mortgage, so to speak, by saying, hey, why don't you refinance my loan? It's worth like $20,000 more now, only 2 months later, right? So, and that's fine as long as that increase in value is actually stable, not speculative. But as you pointed out,
Yeah.
This was speculation, and so eventually, when the music stops, people looking for chairs all of a sudden found there weren't that many chairs left to sit on, and that's when and I thought that the people who really suffered, at least financially speaking, wasn't so much the people who took out the loans, because they basically paid nothing down. Right, it was almost like 0% down payments for them. It was really a bunch of those institutional investors who bought into these like loans, right? Like they repackaged them into mortgage-backed securities as investment products, and then so a bunch of like retirement funds who were told this is AAA, like super safe investment, right? They bought a bunch of these went to shit, and then they got screwed.
Yeah. I know, like, the subprime mortgage issue. I mean, like, tying it all back to land values is an oversimplification. But I do think there's like there's a unique property of land, which is why it's always used as a speculative vehicle in schemes like this, which is that it's an inelastic supply, right? And there's this perception among I think most Americans that your home is a nest egg where you can kind of like expect this continuous increase in value that you don't get from other investments. It's like guaranteed that your home will be worth more when you sell it down the line than it is today. And yeah, there's rampant land speculation all across the country at all times. It's always seen as a very solid investment that in a lot of cases doesn't require a lot of risk.
Yeah,
But,
and
yeah,
I think that's like there's this game that Kevin introduced me to, this card game like back in college. I don't know if we ever played it with you. It's called Fight the Landlord. There was this a couple times I think I mistranslated it to Fuck the Landlord, but I mean it didn't seem misplaced to me because that's just sort of like I feel like there's always a sentiment to like Fuck the landlord.
Yeah,
Fuck that guy.
I mean,
that guy
it's
sucks,
kind of true, right? Like when you're paying a ton of money to live in like a shitty apartment, a lot of the time the amount of money you're paying is not equal to the amount it costs to maintain the apartment building, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in like an expensive coastal city like New York or San Francisco. A lot of that money is just because it's in the location it's in. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that like the land value tax would reduce rents that much. Like there's a difference between like the economic definition of rent and the rent you pay for your apartment, right? You're paying your apartment manager for upkeep and the cost of building and maintaining the building, a bunch of other little services that you would still be charged for if there were a land value tax. But the land value tax could like produce some reduction in like residential rents because it would encourage more efficient use of land, right? So it would theoretically boost housing construction and apartment construction, and that new supply would reduce rents.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like I definitely think Georgism is seeing a renaissance because of the housing crisis and these like questions of why do homeowners in Palo Alto who have lived there since 1960 why are they entitled to all of this money? It's a really legitimate question, and it has a very large impact on the livability of our cities and issues of like equity and redistribution that I don't think have been like really appreciated, right? Like people think of like Jeff Bezos and corporations like Amazon as like these hoarders of wealth who are like screwing over workers. But I think, a large part of the problem is these multi-million-dollar homeowners in places like California who, maybe they aren't billionaires, but they're taking in all of the socially created wealth and, they just get to keep it, right? They're not taxed on it at a very high rate at all. And it's just thousands and thousands of those people who are also creating like a huge equity problem in our economy.
I'd be curious to know, like, what is the percentage? So you take everybody's personal wealth, you add it all up, and what percentage of that is property?
I think it's been done. I've seen it before. I don't know where the source is. I can try and find that later.
You're talking about the share of equity they have in their homes, right? Most folks have mortgages.
Yeah, the share of equity did that. Yeah,
Yeah,
that would be that for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
just
Okay.
because you paid your down payment doesn't mean that you can count all of that as your wealth.
But I think another point for your like fundamental question, Osmond, about how do we tie this back to homelessness or like visible poverty? You can kind of think about like one example Henry George talks about a lot is how in poor countries or less developed places there is the at least visible inequality is not as profound, right? Like if I went to like a village in Africa, yes, everybody is poor, but the the living conditions of the poor there may not be as degrading and
I don't know, man. Here the
sharply
slums,
different
like in India, China. I just
it's like
I don't know. I mean, there are unbelievably poor places in this world. I mean, like
I know.
I like one instance. There's like a couple blocks in Hong Kong that's like the most like densely populated place in the world, and like it's.
But Hong Kong's a great example, right?
world.
Because Hong Kong also has the most expensive housing market in the world.
Okay.
Yeah. Or maybe like if you went to like rural Mississippi or something, like generally everybody is poor, but like the poor aren't living in like these demeaning conditions on the street they might be in like a major city. I don't know if I buy that like characterization that much these days, but he definitely like that was a big part of his like vision for the land value tax, was rectifying the situation.
I thought that description you gave made perfect sense, kind of in a kind of a more developed city versus a less developed city. It's because, as you say, land is limited, right? So if there's bigger wealth gaps, right, there are very rich people, they'd be, as we said, willing to pay top dollar for any piece of land. And so folks who don't have the top dollar, they don't get any land, right? And so in rural Mississippi, as you say, there isn't such a big wealth gap. So everyone can afford some kind of, right? So
like,
it goes hand in hand.
It comes back to speculation, right?
Is it necessarily speculation though? It's not speculation if you know there are people lining up for houses. Like the people who can't afford it, they end up with nothing. That's just
the speculation on like this expectation of perpetually increasing land value, not like even beyond what like demand like offers, right? So
one more point on the theory stuff. There was a slide earlier where you showed the proportion of that one. Could you like just explain again to me why is it that everyone else, because I feel like this margin of production, I guess now that I look at it again, I see why this is said. And this is actually one of the questions I put in into the chat. This is the same kind of reasoning to describe the margin of production I know can be applied exactly to both the labor and the capital components of the factors of production, right? Like just in the same way as the landowner can say, well, if you don't want to pay this rent to me, you can go work on a different plot of land. The laborer can say, well, if you don't want to pay me my wage that I'm asking, you can go find another laborer, right? So then it becomes kind of a supply demand thing. So I feel like that, this, I don't see a strong enough basis to kind of, I just don't see what the basis is to say that the landowners have all the negotiating power, right? So I was
because
wondering,
there's a fixed supply of land, right? That's the difference.
Well, realistically, there is a limited supply of capital and labor as well, right? Like it's not infinite to where they're all like have no value, right? So that's what I was saying. Like, does Georgism provide a detailed description as to the mechanics of how the relative splits of the rents you gain from enterprise are split between these three factions, or is it just assumed that landowners have like basically 100% of negotiating power, and therefore all kind of marginal production gains just go straight to the pockets of the landowners?
There might be some more nuance in progress and poverty on that question.
I think the Apple example probably walks through it, right? I don't know. I don't think I quite internalized the Apple example.
Well, the Apple example, as I understood it, is like it's kind of like the same stuff Dr. Brown was talking about in Econ 201, right? Like the whole like marginal productivity of labor, right? Like wages with some adjustment equal to the marginal productivity of labor, right? Which is kind of like same thing here, except with land, right? The marginal productivity of land. It's like when you only have the plot with one tree, rent you can charge is 3 because the marginal productivity of them using your 4-tree land is 3 over your next best alternative, right? Like so that's kind of why it kind of goes up as more and more land is taken up, right?
That's
By
the
the same
quality of land. Okay, gotcha.
yeah. By the same token, you can say the same thing about labor force, right? They're not all labor is equal, and there is a limited supply, right? So that's why some people in very highly skilled labor jobs can say, well, if you don't pay me, good luck trying to find another plumber in the next 100-mile radius, right? That can actually fix your plumbing situation, right? So in the same way with capital, right? Like I think the same argument applies. It just depends on the relative scarcity in like a supply-demand fashion.
Yes, I mean, I actually did think about this question when I was creating this PowerPoint, and I like really searched for an answer. And the answer I was given was basically that all 3 can apply, right? Like you could still have, you'll have scarcity of labor, scarcity of capital, and a distribution of laborers and capitalists within those factors of production. But the landlord kind of has this overarching power because there is a fixed supply of natural resources, and the landlord under our current system has the right to like fully monopolize like both locations and resources in a way that I think isn't really present in the other 2 factors of production, right? But like the entire idea is like on a macro scale, the proportion of wealth that goes to laborers and capitalists is decreasing as wealth or productivity increases. So even if there are like discrepancies within those factors, if you add it all up, the landlord is taking most of the game.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you could still like, make more money by getting another degree or something like that. But when you are a member of the entire pool of workers and the entire pool of capitalists, all of you collectively will be seeing a smaller share of the economic output of the country as landlords take more.
Is that an empirical thing that they focus on a lot? I know like the original book is quite dated at this point.
Yeah, I mean,
but,
George's
it's
argument
more like an assumption, right? Right. It's more of an assumption.
And like I've seen some like economists online who have like tried to trace this in the real world, showing like they've plotted like the increase in land values nationally versus the increase in wages, and how one outpaces the other. But yeah, I mean, like Progress and Poverty is not an empirically founded book. It is mostly a thought experiment, right? That it turned out to be quite relevant, and that a lot of people really thought kind of summed up a big problem eloquently. But yeah, there's no like hard numbers in the book, unfortunately. But I still like it's still being talked about. There are a lot of prominent economists who still subscribe to the idea. The Economist magazine, while not like a formal economics journal or anything, they're quite a big proponent of the land value tax because they still see it as relevant. And there's I think an increasing amount of literature on how much wealth is kind of being consumed by land, tied up in land. I remember like San Francisco is a popular target because it's so prolific. The housing crisis there. But like land values in San Francisco have just skyrocketed over the past few decades, well beyond the local increase in wages or even local productivity. Right, you're seeing tens of billions of dollars have gone into the valuations of landowners in San Francisco, and it just surpasses anything that you're seeing in the local economy. So that sort of situation is really, I think, prime for like a Georgist analysis.
Have you read Progress and Poverty?
I have. Oh, I've read like 3/4 of it, because it's like a super dense book.
Sure. How long is it?
Oh no, do I have it here? I do. Let me grab it. It's about 550 pages.
Oh, okay. I guess it's it's a pretty dense read.
It's a lot of stuff. Yeah. Because I mean, like, one of the reasons people likes this book so much is that it's like very poetic. Like, people are like, oh yeah, George is a good writer. He's very descriptive, and he gives like a lot of like thought experiments and examples of every idea he presents, kind of showing like how the steps in his logic and how he got to his conclusions. But it ends up being like a very long read because of all of that.
Yeah, I remember seeing on your Goodreads account that you've read the Communist Manifesto.
Oh yeah, a long time ago.
I'm curious if you have like any sort of comparisons, because I don't know, the book sort of feels like
socialist
like an exposition.
Well,
on
it's actually interesting
a political philosophy, right?
Because Marx and George were alive at the same time. And Marx thought that Georgism was like the last dying breath of capitalism, right? It was a last-ditch effort by capitalists to justify their exploitation of workers. And then George thought that Marxism would lead to a dictatorship, right? He saw kind of the writing on the wall that the dictatorship of the proletariat would just become a dictatorship, which is exactly what happens at the Eastern Bloc. So yeah, I mean, they were contemporaries, and they didn't really agree with each other. I think that, ultimately Georgism still retains a faith in markets, right? It uses markets as its like the entire mechanism for its remedy, which is the land value tax, which is like we're determining this tax based on the market value of land. And a big thing that George kind of points out is that people should be entitled to what they produce with their own hands, right? He really likes the entire system of exchanges that happens in like a free market, where you may produce one thing, but you can exchange the value of that thing for something completely different, right? And basically, like the farmer in Iowa, via a big system of exchanges, is doing the same thing as a fisher in Maine, right? They're kind of all tied together. It was really like invested in this idea that if you produce something with your labor, you should be entitled to that value. So that's kind of the other half of the moral argument of Georgism, is that we shouldn't be taxing productive things, right? We shouldn't be taxing income or improvements on land or sales or any of that, because those are products of labor, and people are entitled to the products of their labor. So that's obviously not, I mean, as prominent in communism, where they're like, well, everybody should be entitled to the products of labor equally.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was interesting that like, because they did come around the same time, and like, just big, broad political philosophies. Something about the late 1800s that made everybody start thinking about this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, Georgism was like, it's been cited as like the beginning of the progressive era in American politics, right? It was kind of the first big popular expression or popular movement that came out during the progressive era. It kind of kickstarted all of these other reforms and kind of these big examinations of political and economic structures, and trust busting and welfare reform and stuff like that. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it has its place in American history. It's just sad that it's kind of been ignored ever since basically World War II.
Yeah, well, we're increasing awareness, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's becoming more popular, but yeah, we'll see if it actually ever has an impact in our lifetimes. I think the problem is, like, so many people are invested in land now like home ownership has made it so that anything to do with property taxation is very controversial, and people are relying on land values to boost their like retirement portfolios and their children's prospects. It's just it's difficult to make the argument in our current environment.
Okay. It's been close to an hour and a half now. Anybody have any more closing thoughts on Georgism?
Any last questions, comments?
No, I'm good. Yeah. Thanks again.
Well, I do want to say, I'm sorry if I butchered any of the explanations.
No. I mean,
I thought, I don't know. This actually ended up being harder to give as a presentation than I thought it would be.
Felt like I was back in college, listening to a research seminar from one of my peers.
I'll take that as a
very, very complicated topic. So thank you for making it digestible for us.
Yeah, you're welcome.